want to talk about hurricanes and what I think things are going to be like in the not distant future because of climate change and everything that's going on, human activity changing the weather patterns, the natural warming of the earth in conjunction with that, and what we're leading up to as far as that's concerned. I think that in the future we're going to have to radically change our construction and building codes for buildings that are within 100 miles or 150 miles of the coast. Initially, what's going to happen is, as these weather events become more and more common, and it gets to the point where sections of the Gulf Coast and the East Coast are getting hit by Category 3 and 4 and 5 hurricanes, and eventually probably higher categories, because I suspect they'll have to create a new storm classification if these weather events continue to escalate, which I'm pretty sure they will. They're going to create what's called an exclusionary zone, meaning that to reside in those areas you'll be without insurance, and basically to send assistance into those places where those things are going on when these disasters hit, they'll have to send somebody like the Coast Guard or the National Guard into those places to extract the people who stayed in and became distressed within those exclusionary zones along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and especially in places like Florida. Florida is already really close to having issues with rising sea levels. In some places, when the high tide hits and the sea level is running particularly high, you got water coming up out of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean and coming up through the storm system, through the gutters, and flooding the streets out and intersections. And what's going to happen is eventually they're going to get hit by a hurricane that's so powerful that they're going to have a 25 or 30 or 35 foot storm surge, maybe even higher than that. That's not even accounting for the waves. And they're going to have 100% property destruction below a certain elevation. You've already got parts of Florida that are merging with the ocean, where they had freshwater bodies, lakes or ponds, things like that, that were not that far away from the water, and storms and rising sea levels and high tide have caused these bodies of water to merge with the ocean, and erosion is taking place. But I suspect that Florida, for the most part, will eventually be abandoned completely. And with everything that's going on with climate change and the rapid sea level rise that the Weather Channel is talking about, I suspect that it's going to happen much faster than they think. I give it 10 to 15 years before we have no sea ice left anywhere. I mean, that's really how things are progressing. It's going so much faster than the scientists predicted it would. And right now, the P and R named storms in the Atlantic for the Atlantic hurricane season are happening earlier and earlier than they have in the past. I mean, we haven't even gotten this far into the alphabet that many times as far as hurricanes and storms are concerned. These are going to stay out in the Atlantic, but what I'm saying is that we're going to have to abandon large swaths of real estate. The government's probably going to go in and they're going to offer everybody a buyout. And anybody that refuses to sell when the buyout comes will not have another opportunity to be bought out by the government. They'll be left to fend for themselves and do whatever they have to do to preserve their lives and property when catastrophic flooding comes. In Houston, we've already had a number of different rain events, starting with Allison. Really, in 2001, we had something like 4 feet of rain over the course of 7 days. And then there were smaller floods after that for a while. And most notably, we had Harvey, and we had the Tax Day floods before that. And somewhere between the Tax Day flood and Harvey, we had another one, I think, if I remember right. But they get smaller rain events that are well over a foot on a regular basis. And then they got Harvey, and there was one area to the east of Houston, somewhere between Texas and Louisiana, in that general vicinity, that had 67 inches of rain in 4 or 5 days. And they have white caps over I-10. And then roughly the same area, somewhere between Beaumont and the border, within about, I want to say 18 months or so, they had another flood that was even worse. It flooded even worse because they got nearly 4 feet of rain in 12 hours. And it's just unbelievable that they could get that much. It's 4 inches an hour, steady. So what's going to happen in places like that where those disasters are going on is, initially I think the government's going to develop exclusionary zones because these areas are going to suffer these disasters at such a high frequency so often that it's just not going to be practical for FEMA to be paying to rebuild people's property all the time. The alternative to the exclusionary zones is going to be that people are going to have to build so much of the structure on piers, very much like what you'd see on the Bolivar Peninsula, 15 or 20 feet above the waterline at least, in order to have a very good chance of avoiding most storm surge. Anything really below like a category 3 to 4, they should be able to weather it out. They won't flood that way. They just have to worry about the wind. But I already saw some communities that were under the watershed of the Brazos River, people who were built in low-lying areas, and what they did was they had done this. They had built their homes on top of very tall piers, like a beach house, because the topography made flooding such a regular issue in those places that it was just more practical for them to put piers in than to bring in 150 or 200 dump truckloads of dirt at $90 or $100 a load. Most of which is bank sand they get from the sand pits, and that's generally how they dealt with it. But levees fail, and a lot of the new developments that are going in south of Houston and southeast of Houston are being built in places where the land is very, very cheap. And it's cheap for the developers to buy in because it's swampland. It's places that flood. And the government is allowing them to do this because they're putting these barriers in place so that when the watershed is running really high from the Brazos River, backing up into Oyster Creek and the other waterways that connect to the Brazos River, these levees, this levee system, keeps the worst of the water at bay, and they use pumps to pump the water out of those subdivisions. The problem with that is that eventually we're going to see those levees fail, very much like they did in New Orleans during Katrina. It's just a matter of time. The Corps of Engineers might get out there to reassess every once in a while, but it usually takes something really bad happening, like a catastrophic dam failure or a levee failure, for them to get out there and rebuild everything. But that's not that far off. And like I said, it's going to be the initial solution, just like the buyouts happening in certain parts of Houston where flooding became an extremely severe problem on a regular basis. They were having recurring floods where they get 6 or 8 feet of water in their homes. Some of these more wealthy neighborhoods, they started to buy them out. And if they didn't get bought out, they had to elevate in order to get the money to rebuild. But I think that the flooding is going to become so bad that they're going to develop these exclusionary zones, though. I really believe that that's what the solution is going to be. And people who want to stay in there are going to have to sign some kind of a liability waiver, or basically take their lives into their own hands, because help is not going to come. It's going to be like living on the frontier again when it was first being settled by Americans. That's what I think is going to happen with the hurricanes. It's going to get really bad in a handful of years concerning hurricanes. I mean, our hurricane season is going to end up being extended. We're going to have radically hotter summers, to the point that, we're going to be setting new records every month, year after year, until things get to the point where we're really going to have to put some extreme solutions in place, like maybe launching a solar shade to block the sun for part of the day or something like that. People have devised solutions in science fiction already. You just have to kind of just be looking for these things. It's the rapidly heating ocean temperatures and air temperatures from all the human activity and the natural warming pattern of the Earth that's driving a lot of this stuff. And we aren't doing enough to mitigate what's happening. It's going to get to the point where I think they're going to have to establish something like communal living for the bulk of the population, and they're really not going to be able to bring a whole lot with them, because it just won't be practical to have all that stuff in such a confined space. Small living quarters built really just with the intention in mind of providing basic comforts and a place to stay. It's not going to be destroyed by a major weather disaster. And these weather disasters are going to be happening, like I said, on a very increased basis. And they're going to be happening with more severity because of what people are doing. We're not practicing good sense as far as protecting the environment. These oil spills, BP was just one of them. I mean, there's the Exxon Valdez. There was another one just recently off of some island out there that relied heavily on tourism, and I think Italy responded to that one, and maybe a couple of other countries too. It's just they're not doing enough to prevent environmental damage and deterioration of the climate, to prevent the progression of these things. But the storm surge and the waves from these massive, powerful hurricanes is going to be so bad that I could see it pushing 30, 40, 50 miles inland before it finally gets down to just standard flooding conditions, because things are going to get much worse. We're going to have hurricanes like what the Pacific is getting in a number of years. They're getting all of our carbon emission from the United States. And this carbon accumulating in the atmosphere in high concentration, it exits the United States over California, where the trade winds exchange. Look where the worst wildfires in the country are taking place right now on a regular basis. They're having worse wildfires year after year, and they're not able to mitigate. They're not putting construction solutions in place to address these issues. But our carbon emissions in the United States are creating perfect conditions in the Pacific for them to regularly have super typhoons with winds sometimes up to 200 miles an hour or more. And they've already begun adjusting their construction standards to adapt. And that's out of necessity that they're doing that. But as we continue to develop and we continue to have all this human activity in the U.S., we're overbuilding, we're not allowing Mother Nature room to have that water table where all that water can spread out. We're trying to encroach on land that was never intended to be occupied. That's what we're doing. Places that were designed to flood by nature. The developers are greedy, and that's why they buy the land. And that's what causes the homeowners to flood. They put these temporary stopgap solutions in place, and they say, oh, it's a permanent solution, but they're not being practical. They're going to have to come back and revamp all those protections, because eventually those protections will fail. You're never supposed to live in a place like that, a low place where the water is going to regularly encroach on your home. This is an area that's designed so that the water can spread out from the river basin over a very, very large expanse of land whenever there's a major flood event. And we're going to have precipitation that's much, much worse in the future. I mean, right now, we used to hear about 2 and 3 inches an hour, and in the last few years, it's gone up to 4 or 5 or even 6 inches an hour in some places. Now, imagine when it gets to be like 9 inches or a foot of rain per hour that are falling. That's going to be beyond anything that we can imagine right now. All of this stuff is the progression of human activity. It's man building and developing, making his plans, and we're not respectful of Mother Nature. And it's going to come to a head, and humanity is the one that's going to lose in that battle, because you can't fight against nature. Nature always wins. We'll eventually make this place, with everything that we're doing, we're going to make this a very hostile world to human life. Animal life will adapt in our absence. When it gets to the point where these disasters and weather events are bad enough, we'll be the ones who are pushed out. Just look at what's happening. There's people who are leaving those places where these catastrophic hurricanes and so forth are hitting. Yeah, they apply for FEMA funding, but the smart ones are getting out. If you get completely obliterated by a hurricane, even one time, your house is utterly destroyed by a major weather disaster, that should be a sign, it's time to relocate. It's time to get out of that area, because that happened once, and it's going to happen again. And it's not going to be that long in the future that we're going to be seeing even worse hurricanes than the one that destroyed your home to begin with. People don't see that, we're on a progression. The weather's not getting better, and these disasters are not getting better. They're getting worse as time goes on. And the Weather Channel and our scientists have been telling us this for a long time. It's time that we started listening to them.